Why and how to use podcast chapters. Thank you for joining me for the Audacity to podcast. I'm Daniel G. Lewis. I have an exciting announcement, which I'll share later in this episode. But here's a sneak peek. Podchapters.com is now open for you. Podcast chapters allow your listening audience to get extra context during your podcast or more easily take action and jump to spots in your episodes. So are chapters right for your podcast? I know there might be some immediate negative feelings about supporting something that could allow your audience to skip parts of your episodes. But please give me a chance to convince you why chapters can do more, but that even allowing skipping is actually a good thing. But let's start at the beginning. If you'd like to follow along in the notes for this episode, they are tap or swipe away. Look at the chapters too, or go to theaudacitytopodcast.com/chapters. Number 1, what are podcast chapters? A podcast chapter is a marker placed at a time within an episode. There are currently 3 technological standards for making podcast chapters. Embedded chapters stored inside the MP3 or other media file, often called MP3 chapters or legacy chapters. These have been supported by many popular podcast apps for many years. This is not a new thing. The other standard is Podcasting 2.0 cloud chapters, stored as JSON, that's a special JavaScript format, inside a separate metadata file linked from the RSS feed. Most Podcasting 2.0 apps support cloud chapters, and even Apple Podcasts will be supporting Podcasting 2.0 cloud chapters. And then the third format is Podlove Simple Chapters, stored as XML inside the podcast RSS feed. Oddly, Spotify chose to support this nearly dead standard instead of the other more popular standards. I don't know why Spotify did that, but Spotify does weird things, so I guess it makes sense that they would make the weird decision here. All 3 chapter standards support the same core functionality of what a chapter can do. That is, display a title, optionally display an image, and optionally link to a URL. Those 3 things are the core functionality of a podcast chapter. Podcasting 2.0's cloud chapters also add the ability to include a location and to hide a chapter from the table of contents so that it can't be jumped to and won't display in a chapter list. I'll tell you more about what chapters can be later in this episode, as well as what I hope they can be in the future, not just what they can be in Podcasting 2.0, but what might be coming in the future. But for now, keep in mind that chapters are basically titles or headlines and optional images and or optional links. And this information is placed at certain times in the episode. So podcast apps will display that chapter's information when the playback reaches that point and until the chapter changes. So if you have a title for one chapter, that remains the title for that section until the next chapter is reached. Same thing with images or links. Those will display until the next chapter displays. You can do some little trickery where maybe you keep the same title, but you change the links or you change the images. So it will look like it's the same chapter, but then there would be multiple chapters in the outline unless you do something like the Podcasting 2.0, hiding it from the table of contents. But we'll get into some more of that stuff and how to do that later in this episode. Moving on to number 2, I want to answer this objection that chapters allow audiences to skip content. Yes, it's true that putting chapters in your episodes will allow your audience to skip content they don't want. They might skip points in your episode, they might skip whole segments of your episode, or they might skip ads, but this all depends on how you use your chapters. But even if they are skipping around, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Imagine this. Imagine you were looking for information and you found an article with 5 points in the article. You quickly realize the information you want is in the 4th point. But instead of letting you quickly scroll to get that information you need, the article forces you to view each point before the one you want. Not only that, but the article forces you to read every word until that point that you want. Frustrating, right? I'd probably give up and leave, look for the answer somewhere else. That's what your audience might do. Thankfully, that's not how most websites and browsers work. And that's not how your podcast episodes should work either. But let's be honest, that's kind of the way that we're making our audience engage with our episodes, at least sometimes. Yes, people might skip to what they want from your episode, but don't you want them to get what they want? And don't you want them to get what they want from you instead of being frustrated and looking elsewhere? If you follow me in the Audacity to Podcast for a while, you might recognize that this is the same argument I make for providing thorough show notes or episode notes for each episode. Yes, it means your audience might jump to a section to get what they want. They might not consume all of the content because they're just after certain information. But wouldn't you so much rather be the one providing them that content that they want and allowing them to get it quickly so that they can get it from you and appreciate you for that, than forcing them to consume it in a particular way? They get frustrated and then they turn away and go somewhere else. I would so much rather they get the information from me. I would so much rather you get the information from me. Maybe you've skipped around the chapters in some of my previous episode. That's fine. With me, it's not like I'm telling a story here that you absolutely must consume in a particular order, although I present the information in a particular order that I hope you consume it completely chronologically within that episode. I try not to assume that is how you do it. Even if you have ads in your podcast, this is the other thing that people bring up is, people are going to skip my sponsors if I have chapters. Well, using chapters doesn't mean your ads become skippable. It's all in the style of how you make your chapters. And I'll talk more about the style in a moment, but think of it this way. You don't have to create a chapter for the sponsored spots. Yes, you could create a chapter for that, and then it certainly has its benefits there, but you could have the sponsor inside of a chapter. So if people skip that chapter, they're also skipping content. And it's really about your approach or your style for the chapters that you make. I'll talk more about that style in a little bit in this episode. Number 3, the most helpful benefit of chapters: context. In their simplest form of only titles, podcast chapters can provide your audience with an easy outline of your episode's content. It's similar to handouts you might get for a speech, a lesson, or a sermon. You can see the outline so you can follow along. Plus, it's often very convenient to have the extra context for that section simply by seeing the section's heading. So people might get distracted and might forget exactly what you're talking about, but a quick glance at their podcast app and they can see, this is the section that we're on. We're on point number 3 or point number 4. I can't remember. I can see from the chapter, we're on point number 4. Something like that they can do very quickly and be able to follow along. And being able to follow along like that means your content is more memorable and even more actionable if it becomes more memorable. As you're listening to this episode in your podcast app, you probably see the chapters, and you're probably seeing each of my headings as chapters in your podcast app. So you would see that this section is titled 3, the most helpful benefit of chapters, context. That's the title of this section in my notes, and that's the title of this chapter too. So you can very quickly see, just from glancing at that alone, a quick reminder that I'm talking about context. It's also very similar to how many books, especially nonfiction, have chapter titles and sometimes even section titles at the top or bottom of each page. It helps you follow along. It helps you remember the context as you're reading or as you're consuming that content. Providing that context helps your audience follow along and better understand your content and even remember it better. Those are all great things, right? That's what chapters can do. And that's only from the chapter title. You could also include a picture in your chapter, allowing your audience to quickly see what you're talking about without their having to visit a separate website or without your having to make a video podcast. In fact, they might not have to even unlock their smartphones to see the chapter title and image. They could just glance at it, or their heads-up display, or anything that they're using with their modern technology. Even in their cars, they could just glance over at the podcast app and maybe even see the image right there without having to touch anything. That's thanks to chapters. I did use titles, images, and links in my previous episode, Podcasting During or After Tragedy. I referenced 2 different movies in points 3 and 5 of that episode, and for those chapters, I included the section heading as the chapter title, and an image from the movie's relevant scene, and even a link to that specific movie clip on YouTube. For some of my audience then, they could simply glance at that image and immediately remember that scene from that movie and remember the emotions that they felt or what was said in that movie. Or they could tap on that link from the chapter and then see that. At some point, maybe in the future, they could maybe just press play on the chapter and it would play that video right there in their podcast app. But that's even bigger than what I have envisioned for super chapters, which I'll get into a few points down in this. But they could also then click or tap on that link and take action on that chapter. So that leads into my next point, number 4, the most convenient benefit of chapters, actionability. And yes, actionability is a real word according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary. When you give a chapter a title and image, you're helping your audience with the information you're sharing. But when you add a link, you're making the information actionable. From my testing, every podcast app that supports chapters also allows them to have images and links. It's possible there's some app out there that doesn't do it this way, but in my testing, certainly among the popular apps, they all support those 3 core features, the title, the image, and the link. How the link displays does vary a little bit in the apps, but most apps turn the chapter title into a hyperlink with that URL that you included. So yes, this means there's the potential that the hyperlink doesn't always feel actionable depending on how you title your sections and title your chapters, and then that being hyperlinked. But I do have some hopes and a proposal for Podcasting 2.0's super chapters to make this better in the future, but more on that further in this episode. If you want your audience to take any action or be able to quickly access information, linking to it from a chapter makes that action extremely convenient because the listener doesn't have to go to your website. They don't have to try scrolling through your episode notes inside their podcast app. They don't have to try to remember a URL that you speak. Even though I try to make my URLs more memorable, like theaudacitytopodcast.com/chapters for this, that is still something you have to remember. But if you're using your chapters to link to certain things or provide certain actions, your audience doesn't have to remember those URLs because they are right there for them to tap right when you're talking about it. Not somewhere else in your episode, but right there. When you're talking about that link, the link is there for them to click. And they can usually then tap on that chapter while it's playing and be taken to that destination. And they're taking action then without leaving the podcast app. I mean that they can take that initial action of visiting the link. Then whatever that link does after they tap on it, that might take them out of the podcast app. But getting them to that first step is so much more seamless when you're using chapters. And what that link can do is pretty cool too. You're probably familiar with a URL. That is the thing that's https://theaudacitytopodcast.com/chapters. That's a URL. But chapters don't have to link to only web pages. They could be a special link called a mail to link that triggers an email. And that can be simply a blank email to a specific email address, but you can even pre-fill certain information in that email. So imagine having your chapter link to your email address, pre-populating the subject line with the name of that episode or with whatever subject line is helpful to you. So then when someone taps on that link in their podcast app, it is opening their email app, starting a new email message to your email address with the subject already entered in. That's pretty cool, right? That's just with a mail to link. They could also be links to your phone number so that if someone taps on that from their smartphone, it immediately then calls, or it might pop up a little prompt saying, do you want to call this phone number? They just tap on the button to call, and then they're calling your voicemail number. Or it could also be a click to text kind of link that has a special SMS code in it so that when people tap on that, it instantly opens up a text message that they could send to you. Think of this like Buzzsprout's fan mail feature that's powered through SMS texting. You could link to that from a chapter. And you can link to other kinds of actions that can be triggered from a URL pattern like this. It could be to special resources inside of other apps, maybe even something inside the current podcast app. There are so many potential things that you could do. Just imagine some of these potentials with different kinds of links. When you're talking about a favorite resource, you could add your affiliate link to the chapter so your audience can quickly buy it by clicking on the link from your chapter. Or when you're thanking your audience for their support, you could link the chapter to your support or value page so others can quickly give their own support too. Or when you're doing a baked-in advertisement for a sponsor, you could link that chapter to the advertiser's site to make that call to action more convenient. Or for any call to action, maybe you're selling your own stuff or you're promoting an upcoming event that you're doing. You could link to that in the chapter so that people could tap on that link that's presented right then and take action on that link. Or when you're asking for feedback, you could link that chapter to your feedback page or even directly to your email address or SMS number, like for the Buzzsprout fan mail feature or other things like that. Or you could link it to, if you use the feedback feature on Podgagement, you could link to that. So right there, people can very quickly tap on that to write a message to you or record a message to you through the feedback page that Podgagement offers. Each of these can be more actionable by linking to them from the chapter at the time when it's most relevant. And your audience doesn't have to remember special links or URLs or even remember your brand. They can simply tap the link right then. They don't have to jump around in your notes to find the link. It's right there, right then. And you can say that. You can say, if you've got the chapter displaying right now, tap on that link or go to, and make sure that you do support those fallback options. Don't assume that everyone in your audience can see the chapters or can take action on the chapters. So it's still a good idea to provide that fallback. Just like I will say, and will continue to say in my episodes in the future, the URL for that episode instead of only relying on what's in the notes. Although I've been experimenting a little bit with what happens if I only rely on the notes. But you can support that feedback. So if you're telling people, for the audacitytopodcast.com/giveback, which is the page where you can give back to the Audacity to Podcast, cleverly named URL, right? If you value the podcast, you can give back to it whatever amount you see fit through that page. So yes, I can speak that URL in the podcast, which is still good to do because then people can hear that if they need that option, but I can also link to that in the chapter. And I've been doing that in my chapters recently when I've been thanking the people who have given some value back to the Audacity to Podcast. I'm able to add that link in those chapters so that someone else could see that and tap on that and think, I want to give some value too. And they can do that right through that special link. Number 5, how to chapter your podcast episodes. Let's break chaptering into 2 steps, style and actually adding the chapters. First, pick your chaptering style. I generally suggest that the easiest and best way to decide what chapters to make is by looking at how your content is naturally divided. If your content has any kind of outline already, as most of my episodes do, those are your chapters right there. And if your content has multiple segments, different stories, that even if it's news or comedy or scene changes or certain major themes in the episode, those are also ideal places to have new chapters. When I did a TV show fan podcast about the TV show Once Upon a Time, we would divide our conversation into talking about certain scenes that happened in the episode. Sometimes we might jump around a little bit, but we were basically talking about those core scenes, or even sometimes talking about certain themes of the episode. Each one of those could have been a chapter, but I wasn't doing chapters back then. There will be times you'll have to consider how deep your chapters should go. For example, we are right now in a second level of headings, if you look at the notes for this episode. But I've chosen to give both this subheading and the next subheading their own chapters so that it's easier for you to follow along if you're looking at the chapters inside your podcast app and you can see my basic outline. So even though the chapter that came right before this one was only a few seconds long, still it allows you to see that basic outline. You might also run into a case where you have a single section, but you want to share multiple images or multiple links. Until super chapters are accepted in Podcasting 2.0, and I'll talk more about those in a moment, the best thing you can do is link to a single page with those multiple links, or link to the relevant section of a page with URL targets. For example, adding a hashtag and then the section title to a URL, usually after the last slash or after the last part of the URL, but before any question marks or ampersands. Doing that can link to a section of that page that uses the title attribute for that link or heading. That's a little technical, I know. When you're adding your heading, see if there's a way for you to give that heading a special HTML title to it. That's very easy to do with hyperlinks, but you can also do it with other HTML elements. You can do this in WordPress and in some other editors. And then you can try it. Try visiting the URL for that page with that pound sign or hash sign, and then whatever that title is that you gave it. Stick to lowercase, no spaces, only use hyphens or underscores, maybe even not those. It doesn't really have to make sense what you use, but just make sure it's consistent so you know how to link to it. You could link your chapters that way as well. And I've done this before in some of my past episodes as a little experiment. I wanted to see how the podcast apps would handle it, where I linked each chapter to that section in the full notes. You could do that. You could even use an AI, or more accurately called an LLM, a large language model, but some kind of AI-powered tool to suggest the chapters for you. There are some shortcomings to this, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, but it is something that you could use, and that could certainly save you a lot of time. So those are the ways that you could consider your style for the chapters, or what you might turn into a chapter. The second thing is to then add the chapters with the right tools. There are multiple tools to add chapters to podcast episodes. Some hosting providers, such as Blueberry, Captivate, Buzzsprout, RSS.com, and some others, offer those built-in tools to add your chapters. There are also some installable apps that can add chapters to your MP3 files, like Forecast for macOS, Podcast Chapters for macOS, and Hindenburg for Windows and macOS. And some ID3 editors can add chapters too, but maybe not the full features of it. Like even PA Software's ID3 editor app can add chapters. It's very clunky to do, and you can't add images to those chapters. So it's not the best way. It works, yeah, but it's not the best way. The hosting providers also offer AI-powered chapter suggestions, where the system looks at your episode transcript and tries to suggest chapters for you, sometimes even placing those chapters automatically in your episode for you. But in my experience, the results are often too granular, resulting in too many chapters. Like sometimes even dividing the chapters within your paragraph of what you're talking about, and then you've got two chapters, like one sentence for one chapter and another sentence for another chapter. That's just too much. And such systems often ignore the outline you actually have and are actually speaking in your episode. Like my episodes, I'm usually speaking my outline, but many of these AI tools don't detect the outline that I am literally speaking into my episode. The installable apps sometimes offer more manual control, sometimes letting you place a marker in the audio waveform while listening to the episode. Like that's what you can do with the Podcast Chapters app for macOS or Hindenburg. And sometimes the apps like Forecast offer only a timestamp field where you manually enter in the minutes and seconds. And many of these apps let you enter only minutes, seconds, or hours too if your episodes are that long. But you can't do millisecond precision. So sometimes your chapter might be placed in the middle of a word, and you have to figure out, okay, which word am I going to cut off? Will I cut off where I'm saying number, or will I cut off whatever word I said before I said number one? You have to make those kinds of decisions when you only get second level precision like that. You can only place it at a 0-second level. As you can tell, each of these methods have their shortcomings, potentially time-sucking deal breakers even. And that's why I finally decided to create something better. So I'm thrilled to announce to you the public launch and availability of Pod Chapters. After using, I think, every popular podcast chapter adding tool out there, I'm quite certain Pod Chapters is the fastest, easiest, and smartest way to chapter your podcast. Yes, I created it. So of course I'm biased, but I created it because I was frustrated using all of these other tools. If you want, you can manually place your chapters in the audio waveform through Pod Chapters. And in fact, there is a very inexpensive plan that lets you do that. You can place chapters very manually. Still, it's a much better way to do it than the other apps because you can simply drag the chapters around if you didn't get it placed at just the right spot. You can zoom in on the waveform and place the chapter exactly where you want with millisecond precision so you're not cutting off any of the words. So yes, you can do that stuff manually and so much better in Podchapters than any of the other options out there. But where Podchapters really excels is when you use the AI-powered features. And the first time that I got Podchapters to do this magic for me, I got goosebumps. Really, I actually did. That time that I pressed the button and I saw it do its magic and it did it so well, I got goosebumps. And you know what I did after that? I pressed the button again and I deleted the chapters and I pressed the button again over and over because I was just enjoying the magic of it so much. I don't recommend that you do that if you sign up for Podchapters because you might just see the same thing over and over and that's just costing credits. But you can use Podchapters to do that kind of magic for you. And you can either provide your own transcript, we could call it BYOT, bring your own transcript, and then that can save you on the AI credits. Or you can use Podchapters to transcribe your podcast for you. And I think Podchapters has some really nice features in it to make those transcripts. Like, yes, it can do the speaker detection, but it can do some other really cool stuff, like allowing you to enter in a list of, we could call them proper nouns that you frequently say in your podcast so that the transcript is correct with those things. For example, I always enter the Audacity to podcast, my name, Daniel J. Lewis, Podchapters, Podgagement, Podcasting 2.0. That's in my special preset that I apply now to every episode. Yes, you can save presets so you don't have to retype all of this stuff. So every episode that I create gets that and maybe a couple of other things in there as some key terms. Those are the proper nouns that I want to make sure it capitalizes them properly and it transcribes them properly. You can add those in. And then per episode, you can add more on top of that. So maybe someone's name that you mentioned in that episode. And this is so that the transcript will more accurately transcribe those things. You can also add in some basic find and replace stuff. Like I see even the best transcription tools sometimes split the word the from the audacitytopodcast.com. Sometimes it's with the, sometimes it's without the, or there's a space there. Sometimes it puts the number 2 in the middle instead of TO. So I have certain find and replace operations in there, and you can change the order of them too, so that it will always properly transcribe those things. And I don't have to look through the transcript and edit those things later because I know it can do that. Another thing that frequently the transcripts get wrong is when I say the give back URL, sometimes it will be /give space back instead of /give back, like one word after the slash. So I can just put that in the find and replace to say, whenever you see /give space back, replace it with /give back with no space in it. That find and replace you can put in there. So when it transcribes it for you, you get a more accurate transcript. So when you've got that transcript, whether you provide it or you have Podchapters generate it for you, then the AI can suggest the chapters for you and even then automatically place them. And if you don't like the chapters, you can edit them. You can drag them around however you want. Now, yes, other tools can do this too, but I have tweaked the AI a whole lot to get great results with all my tests, even to the point that it does recognize when I speak my outline, it will recognize that as chapters and suggest those as the chapters. And from the beta testers who have been using Podchapters now for a couple of weeks, many of them have said, yeah, these chapters are fantastic, so much better than what I've gotten from other tools. So you can then edit those chapters, delete any of them that you want, move them around if you want. It's really easy to use. And something no one else offers, but that I have suggested and requested from multiple other people for years. So I've had this idea for years to build this, but no one's done it. So Podchapters is the first tool to do this. And that is, I love this. I even call it an amazing ability to take the outline you provide and automatically turn it into chapters for you with amazing precision. For example, since I always know what I want my chapters to be, that is the outline for my episode, I simply paste that outline into Podchapters and click a button for it to place my chapters, and it does it. And it saves me all kind of time and frustration of looking, where is this chapter supposed to go? I don't have to worry about that. I tell it, these are what the chapters are supposed to be, and then it goes and places them for me. And yes, sometimes it's slightly off, like a second or a half a second. And that's where I can just click to jump to that chapter and very quickly just drag it ever so slightly, whichever direction I need it to be. And it's very fast and easy to be able to listen back to those chapters to make sure that they're placed correctly. For real, what I'm about to share with you, is the workflow that I or my assistant, Steve Moody, would have to do for every episode. And it's mostly replaced now with pod chapters. It would start with after the episode was edited and it was finished and ready to be published, almost ready, but the episode itself had been edited. So I had the final MP3 file that has all the audio in it. Then we would run that through Mac Whisper Pro to transcribe it, and sometimes doing it with one or two different styles of transcripts. Then we would use ID3 editor to add the basic ID3 tags in that, pulling from a template. Then we would add chapters with the Podcast Chapters app, which is macOS only. And that took a lot of time because we had to look for where to place the chapters. And I'll be honest, using Podcast Chapters was often very stressful because of certain weird things about the ways it works that might just be a personal thing, but were definitely frustrating. So then after the chapters were placed, then we would export the transcript and the Podcasting 2.0 chapters as those files, and they'd have to go somewhere. So I would upload them to a content distribution network or a CDN. And then finally, I could add the hyperlink to the transcript and the Podcasting 2.0 chapters inside of PowerPress, which is what I'm using for creating my RSS feed right now. So all of those steps are now, except for the last one of adding the URLs, all of those can be done with one tool, Pod Chapters. And yes, that means that Pod Chapters can even host your transcript file and your Podcasting 2.0 chapters for you. You don't need a separate CDN. You don't have to upload those files. Pod Chapters will just give you the URL and you can paste that into your system if you need a URL for that, or if you want to upload the chapters and the transcript into your own system, you can do that. Or if you're saving the chapters into the MP3 file, which Pod Chapters will do for you, many of the podcast hosting providers can read the chapters from the MP3 file. So even though there is some overlap, still you can use one tool to create the chapters, and then your hosting provider can populate those other areas that you need. Pod Chapters really does everything you need to add engaging chapters to your podcast, potentially in as little as 30 seconds. And that is real life testing. I've tested several of my episodes to see how quickly could I go from not even a transcript, just the MP3 file, to a transcribed and correctly chaptered file. And I've sometimes gotten it as low as 20 seconds. But 30 seconds, a little bit of a buffer there, especially depending on how big the episode is. But that is from real world testing. If you have longer episodes or more chapters, yes, it potentially takes longer, but still, most of this is automated and it's in one tool. I made Pod Chapters first for myself. And if you can't tell, I am so excited about this tool. And as I made this for myself, I then realized how much time and frustration it could save you, especially if you're on Windows or Linux, where there are very few options for making podcast chapters. Pod Chapters runs in the browser, so it works on any modern device. Yes, it even works on an iPhone, though I know, at least at this time, I still need to optimize the interface a little bit more for small screen devices, but it does function on an iPhone. So that means it would obviously function on an iPad too, on a bigger screen like that. So you can start chaptering your podcast the smart way now at podchapters.com. Sign up over there. I would love to have you using Pod Chapters. I know I spent a lot of time talking about Pod Chapters. That's my little ad for this. Sign up for Pod Chapters. But it really is something that I want you to use because I want you to not have that pain of using all of these different apps or getting frustrated with the chapters that the AI suggests for you. And I'd love your feedback on it too. If you have a case where you feel like the chapters it gave you weren't quite what you wanted, certainly you can edit that, but let me know. And let me know what you were hoping it would give you. Or if you give it your own outline, then it does its magic really well. I really want you to try Pod Chapters. If you couldn't tell, I am super excited about it. But back to content. Number 6, Podcasting 2.0 cloud chapters are already better. At its core, Podcasting 2.0 cloud chapters do the same things as legacy chapters. That is a title, an optional image, and an optional link. The 2.0 chapters do also add the ability to include a location and hide the chapter from the table of contents, But those are very specific use cases. Beyond that, simply by moving the chapters out of the RSS feed, and especially out of the MP3 files where legacy chapters live, simply moving it out there to host it on the cloud, that's why they're called cloud chapters, enables some really cool things. And some of those things I'll be supporting in the future with pod chapters. For example, you could replace a chapter image to reflect more urgency as some deadline approaches. So if you've got a conference coming up or some product you're selling or anything like that, you could have an image that promotes that. And then as it gets closer, you could change that image to say how many spots are left for that thing, or even make it a sort of countdown where you say 5 days left, 4 days left, 3 days left, 2 days left. And then you replace the image after the event with saying, sorry, please check back next time. You could replace the URL destination of a chapter, and you could edit anything about those chapters, completely changing what the chapters are, all by editing the tiny episode metadata file, or sometimes called a chapters file, without editing the MP3. And the huge benefit of that is that means you don't have to re-upload the MP3 file, and your audience doesn't have to re-download it, because your audience in a modern Podcasting 2.0 app will have access to those new chapters without having to re-download your episode or for you to re-upload the episode, because the chapters are managed separately in the cloud. That's why they're called cloud chapters. But I think chapters can do more than that. So that's why, number 7, Podcasting 2.0 could bring super chapters. If you couldn't tell, chapters are one of my favorite features of Podcasting 2.0. And so I've proposed some ways that Podcasting 2.0 chapters could be so much better than the legacy functionality they still basically are. That is, title, optional image, and optional link. The two biggest things I've proposed are galleries and text blocks. Consider a podcaster who wants to share a bunch of images from a relevant trip. She could tell her audience to visit her website to view all the images, or she could painstakingly make a chapter for each image. But doing that forces the audience to see the images at the pace of the chapters, which would likely require interrupting the podcast multiple times, as the audience might want to spend more time to look at an image, maybe less time on other images. That's where a gallery chapter could come in. A single chapter could contain all the images from that trip. There would be just the one chapter as the host is talking about her trip, but the audience could swipe through the gallery of images at their own pace while listening and without leaving the podcast app. Text block chapters would allow a chapter to have more text than only a title. It could contain, for example, bullet points, a quotation, or multiple links instead of only one link. I've got some links in the notes for this episode at theaudacitytopodcast.com/chapters for some other episodes where I have talked more in depth about specifically Podcasting 2.0 chapters and super chapters. So I'd love for you to check them out, including the podcast that I co-host with Dave Jackson, The Future of Podcasting. And please definitely check out pod chapters. Special thanks to Steve Wilkinson, who sent 1234 Satoshis saying, thanks for all you do in podcasting. Well, thank you, Steve, for that kind support. And if you value the Audacity podcast, the help and the inspiration and information, maybe even a little bit of entertainment that I provide here and there, and you want to give some of that value back, whatever you feel it's worth to you, you can do so at theaudacitytopodcast.com/giveback or through your modern Podcasting 2.0 app. And the other thing that you could do is simply tell other people about the Audacity to Podcast, or especially about my brand new product, Pod Chapters, at podchapters.com. And thank you for signing up to use Pod Chapters. And now that I've given you some of the guts and taught you some of the tools, it's time for you to go start and grow your own podcast with chapters for passion and profit. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from theaudacitytopodcast.com. Thanks for listening.